She found them in a box beneath his desk. Not one letter, not a handful, hundreds of them bundled in black ribbon, each one sealed and never sent, each one addressed in a hand she did not immediately recognize, until she turned the topmost envelope over and saw her own name written there with a care that looked almost like reverence. Annabel. Just that. No family name. No Miss Voss. Simply her given name, written over and over across hundreds of envelopes spanning 7 years, as though he had been speaking to her across a vast and terrible silence, calling to her in letters she was never supposed to find. Her hands were still red, still raw from the morning's work, and they shook as she held his words for the very first time. Welcome to the Duke's Revenge. The story, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the smell of lye soap and cold stone, the ache in your knuckles after hours on your knees, the sound of a door above your head opening, and the particular quality of silence that follows. The kind that tells you someone is watching you work, not to help, but to confirm that you know your place. Now imagine that you were not born to any of this. That there was a time, not so very long ago, when your hands were smooth, when you wore muslin in summer and wool in winter and called no woman mistress except your own mother, when your father read to you in the evenings and called you his clever girl and said, with great sincerity because he was that kind of man, that you were worth more than any title England could bestow. He said that until the winter he died. After that, no one said it any more. This is where our story begins tonight on the Duke's Revenge. Before we step into this world together, tell me, where are you? What time is it where you are? Whether you're listening at sunrise or long past midnight, I want to know. Drop your city in the comments. We're a global community here, and every comment reminds me that these stories travel farther than I ever imagined. Now, let me paint the scene for you. The year was 1851, and Annabel Voss had stopped believing that things would ever change. She was 22 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years learning what it meant to be invisible. It had not always been so. Her father, Mr. Gerald Voss, had been a man of modest but respectable means. A solicitor of some reputation in the county of Wiltshire, with a pleasant house and a small income and a daughter he adored beyond all reasonable measure. Annabel had grown up with books and music lessons, and the quiet certainty that she was loved. She had grown up, in other words, entirely unprepared for what was coming. Gerald Voss died in the autumn of 1847, and within a fortnight of his burial, everything Annabel had known collapsed around her like a poorly built wall in a hard rain. Now, it is important to understand something about inheritance law in 1851 England, because what happened to Annabel was not unusual. It was, in fact, devastatingly ordinary. When a father died without a surviving male heir and without a carefully constructed will, the distribution of his estate was left to the courts and, in many cases, to the discretion of his nearest male relative. Gerald Voss had a brother, Bertram Voss, a man of expensive tastes and chronically poor finances. In the months before Gerald's death, and without Gerald's knowledge, Bertram had taken quiet steps to position himself as the legal guardian of Gerald's minor child and the administrator of Gerald's estate. He had done this through a series of legal maneuvers that were, strictly speaking, within the bounds of the law, and entirely contrary to the spirit of every decent thing Gerald Voss had ever stood for. By Christmas of 1847, the pleasant house belonged to Bertram. The small income was being managed, which is to say, spent, by Bertram. And Annabel was living in the servants' quarters of what had once been her own home, because her uncle had decided that a niece without a dowry was of no more use to him than an extra pair of hands. She scrubbed his floors. She laundered his wife's gowns. She was not paid. She was told, when she dared to ask, that her labor was simply the repayment of a debt she owed for being housed and fed, a debt that seemed to grow rather than diminish with each passing season. Olympia Voss, Bertram's wife, was a woman of formidable social ambition and very little warmth. She had 2 daughters of her own, Georgiana and Mabel, both younger than Annabel, both being carefully prepared for the London season at enormous expense. And she treated her husband's niece with the particular cruelty of someone who considers themselves to be performing a charity they have not been adequately thanked for. "You should be grateful," Olympia said often. "Without us, you would be on the street." Annabel had learned not to respond. She had learned a great many things in 4 years. She had learned to make herself small, to move through rooms without being noticed, to eat quickly and sleep lightly and keep her thoughts behind her teeth. She had learned that anger was a luxury she could not afford, and that hope, if poorly managed, was more dangerous than despair. What she had not quite managed to extinguish, despite considerable effort, was her capacity for observation. She noticed everything. She always had. It was the quality her father had loved best in her, and the quality that had served her most poorly since his death, because noticing everything meant that she could not pretend not to see the ways in which she was being diminished. Every slight landed fully. Every cruelty registered precisely. She felt it all. She simply did not show it. And the effort of that containment had left a particular quality to her stillness, a kind of banked intensity that the less observant members of the Voss household mistook for resignation. She was not resigned. She was waiting. She simply had no idea what she was waiting for. She found out on a Tuesday morning in March, when a letter arrived at Voss House bearing a ducal seal she had never seen before. Bertram Voss had debts. This was not new information. Annabel had understood for at least 2 years that her uncle's financial situation was considerably worse than he let on. She had overheard conversations she was not meant to overhear. She had seen the expressions on the faces of men who came to the house and left looking dissatisfied. She had noticed, with her infuriating precision, that the silver candlesticks had been quietly replaced with brass ones, and that Olympia's newest evening gown was made of fabric that was only almost silk. What she did not know was the scale of it. Bertram Voss owed money to a great number of people. He had borrowed against the house, against Gerald's former accounts, against future earnings from properties he no longer technically owned. He had borrowed. In short, against everything. And one of the people he had borrowed from was a man whose patience was apparently not inexhaustible. Cedric Ashmore, Duke of Waverley, did not send polite reminders. He sent solicitors. The letter that arrived on that Tuesday morning was the 3rd such communication in as many months. And this one contained a date by which certain arrangements were to be made or certain consequences were to follow. Annabel knew this because she had carried the letter from the hall to her uncle's study and she was not proud of it, but she was not ashamed of it either, read every word before delivering it. She stood outside the study door for a long moment after sliding it beneath, listening to the silence on the other side, and then the muffled sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Then her uncle's voice, low and furious. Then Olympia's answering hiss. Annabel went back to the kitchen and resumed polishing the silver. She did not know then that the Duke of Waverley had also sent a personal request, not to her uncle, not through solicitors, to her. She found the second letter 3 days later tucked behind the hall mirror where the post was sometimes left, which is to say where it was sometimes forgotten or deliberately delayed if Bertram wished to intercept it. She nearly missed it entirely. It was only her habit of thoroughness in her cleaning duties, and perhaps something else, some instinct she could not explain, that made her reach behind the frame and find the small envelope with her name on it. Just that. Annabel. No family name. She opened it in the kitchen, standing with her back to the door. Miss Voss, I should like to call upon you at your earliest convenience. There are matters I believe you deserve to understand. I will come Thursday at 3 o'clock, if that is acceptable. If it is not, send word, and I will adjust. I am, etc. Waverley. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in her pocket. She did not tell her uncle. On Thursday, at precisely 3 o'clock, a carriage arrived at the gate of Voss House that was so fine and so black and so unmistakably expensive that 3 of the neighbours came to their windows to observe its arrival. Annabel had spent the intervening days in a state of controlled anxiety that she was fairly sure no one had noticed. She had told herself with great firmness that there was nothing to be anxious about. A duke was calling because he had business with her uncle. Whatever those matters were that she supposedly deserved to understand, they were almost certainly financial in nature and almost certainly not about her in any meaningful personal sense. She had believed this approximately 40% of the time. The other 60% she had stood at her small window in the servants' quarters and stared at the grey March sky and felt something she didn't have a name for. A kind of charged anticipation, as though the air before a storm. She was in the kitchen when the bell rang. She heard Olympia's sharp voice in the hall, the formal pleasantries exchanged with the visitor, the sound of footsteps moving toward the drawing-room. Then a pause. Then her name, called in Olympia's most quelling tone. "Annabel, come here." She smoothed her apron. Then she removed it, because something told her to, and folded it on the kitchen table and walked down the hall with her chin level and her hands still. She had expected a great many things of the Duke of Waverley. She had not expected him to be standing in the drawing-room doorway watching her approach with an expression that was entirely illegible, but entirely... She was sure of it. She could not have said why. Not hostile. He was tall, dark. Somewhere in his mid-30s, she thought, with the kind of face that looked as though it had been designed to reveal nothing. He had grey eyes, not the warm grey of winter sky, but the cold grey of very deep water, and he was looking at her with them in a way that made her want to look away and forbade her to do so at the same time. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Olympia, standing between them with the expression of someone who has invited a wolf into her drawing-room and is only now regretting it, said with artificial brightness, "His Grace was kind enough to wish to discuss certain matters with the family." "With Miss Voss," the Duke said. He did not look at Olympia when he said it. He did not look at anything, except Annabel. "Privately, if you please." The silence that followed was a specific variety of silence that Annabel had learned to catalogue over 4 years of servitude. This one was the kind generated by a social superior, delivering a request that is not actually a request, but is phrased as one as a courtesy. It was the kind of silence into which protest was technically possible, but practically suicidal. Olympia made a sound. Then she left the room. The Duke turned and walked back into the drawing-room. After a moment, Annabel followed. He did not sit. Neither did she at first. She was accustomed to standing in rooms where her betters were seated, and it took a conscious effort to remember that whatever she was in this house, she was still the daughter of a solicitor who had once had every right to drawing-room furniture. She sat. He remained standing, looking out the window at the grey garden, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'll be direct with you," he said. "I have been watching this household for some time, not from any personal interest in your uncle's affairs. Those are of very limited appeal, but because I had reason to believe that Gerald Voss's estate was being administered in a manner inconsistent with his documented wishes." Annabel went very still. "Your father left a will," the Duke said. "I expect no one told you that." "No," she said. Her voice was level. No one told me that. The will was suppressed. I have reason to believe your uncle was aware of its existence and took steps to ensure it was not submitted to probate, among other irregularities. He turned from the window then and looked at her directly. I am telling you this because you deserve to know it, and because I intend to do something about it. Annabel's hands were folded in her lap. She looked at them for a moment. The redness at the knuckles, the roughness of the palms, and then she looked up at him. Why? She asked. It was the simplest question. It was the only question that mattered. Something moved across his face, quickly controlled. Because it is wrong, he said, and because I am in a position to remedy it. She held his gaze. She did not particularly believe that the Duke of Waverley had ridden from wherever he had come from solely out of a devotion to abstract justice. She was 22 years old and had spent 4 years learning how the world actually worked, which had cured her permanently of certain illusions. But she also did not think he was lying to her. There was something in his manner, a precision, a restrained intensity, that suggested someone who chose his words with great care and meant all of them. What are you proposing, Your Grace? She asked. A marriage, he said. Now, it is important to understand what marriage meant for a woman in 1851 England, because it shapes everything that follows. Under the laws of coverture, which governed English marriage at this time, a woman who married legally ceased to exist as an independent person. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter contracts, could not sue or be sued, could not retain her own earnings. Even her children belonged, in law, to her husband. The Married Women's Property Act would not pass until 1870, nearly 20 years in the future. In 1851, when Annabel sat across from the Duke of Waverley and heard the word marriage, she was hearing a proposal that would transfer, whatever theoretical legal status she retained entirely to another man. This is why her first instinct was not gratitude. It was wariness. She had already had everything taken from her by men with legal authority over her life. She was not eager to trade one form of powerlessness for another, however elegant the alternative. No, she said. He didn't flinch. If anything, something in his expression settled, as though her refusal confirmed something he had already known. That is your prerogative, he said. You are remarkably calm about it. I expected it. He moved from the window to the chair across from hers, a deliberate choice, she noted, to sit rather than stand over her, to make the conversation level. You would be foolish to accept a proposal from a stranger, and you are not foolish. You know nothing about what I am. I know considerably more than you might expect, he said quietly. She looked at him. The afternoon light was thin and cold, and it fell across the plains of his face in a way that made him look less like a duke and more like a man who had been thinking about something for a very long time. Why me? She asked. Of all the women in England. He was silent for a moment. Then, that is a longer answer than I can give you today. Then I suggest you return when you're prepared to give it. She stood. He stood. Quickly, instinctively, which surprised her. A courtesy. She hadn't expected courtesy. Miss Voss. His voice stopped her at the door. Whatever you decide, the matter of your father's will proceeds regardless. The legal irregularities your uncle committed are documented. He will be held to account for them. Your inheritance will be restored. She turned. Then I don't need to marry you. No, he agreed. You don't. She waited. But your uncle's case will take time, he said. Months, possibly longer. In the meantime, you remain in this house, subject to whatever your uncle chooses to do about the fact that his game is ending. Men, in desperate financial situations, make poor decisions. I am offering you a way out of this house today. That is all." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said, and she walked out of the drawing room before he could say anything else. She thought about it for 6 days. It was not, as one might imagine, a simple calculation. On one side of the scale, escape, security, the end of the red hands and the cold room, and Olympia's voice saying you should be grateful, in a tone that made gratitude feel like a degradation. On the other side, everything she did not know. The Duke was a stranger. He was cold and controlled and watched her with those grey eyes in a way she could not quite pass. His kindness, if it was kindness, might be a different variety of constraint. She had already lived inside one man's authority over her life. She was not confident she knew how to choose better. She asked questions instead, quietly, carefully, in the way she had learned to gather information without alerting anyone to the gathering. She spoke to the Dowager Countess of Langley, an elderly widow who lived 2 miles distant and who had known Annabel's father and who, unlike most of the county, did not regard Annabel's current circumstances as entirely natural or deserved. The Countess had a sharp mind and a long memory and a complete indifference to Bertram Voss's good opinion. "Waverley," the Countess said when Annabel described her visitor with careful vagueness. "Cedric Ashmore. You're asking about Cedric Ashmore." "I'm asking about his character." "His character is broadly considered to be inflexible, private, and approximately twice as intelligent as any other man in a given room. He is not charming. He is not interested in being charming. He has very few friends and a great many people who are afraid of him." She handed Annabel her cup. "He is also, and I say this on the basis of 40 years of watching this county's men, almost certainly the most honest person you will ever meet." Annabel held her cup. "Honest. He says what he means. He does what he says. He has never, to my knowledge, broken a promise or made one he didn't intend to keep. Whether that constitutes a good man is a separate question. Goodness is more complicated than honesty. But it means you can believe him." The Countess looked at her steadily. "If he said he intends to help you, he intends to help you." "And if he said he wants to marry me?" The Countess was quiet for a moment. "Then he wants to marry you," she said. "The question I would be asking is why?" Annabel did not have the answer to that question when she sent her reply. She had simply reached the point where the weight of uncertainty was less than the weight of where she currently was. She sent word on the 6th day, Thursday at 3 o'clock. He came back. He sat across from her again in the drawing room, where Olympia hovered at the periphery trying to listen, and he answered her questions with the same careful precision he had shown before, and when she finally asked, again, why her, why this, why now, he said, "I knew your father." She stared at him. "Not well," he said. "He handled a legal matter for my man of affairs some years ago. I met him twice. He was a good man." A pause. "He spoke of you." What did he say?" Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door opens a crack when someone leans against it from the other side. "He said you were the most observant person he had ever met," Cedric said, "and that he hoped the world would be kind to you, but that he suspected it wouldn't always be." Annabel's throat closed. "When I heard what your uncle had done, what had happened to you, I began looking into it." His voice was measured. "I am sorry it took me this long to act." She looked at him for a long time. There was something in those grey eyes that she hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to see. Something that looked, improbably, like guilt. "You said," she managed, "that Thursday was acceptable if I had no objection." "Yes." "I have a condition," she said. "Name it." I will not be a hostage. If this marriage is a different kind of cage, I need you to tell me now." He met her gaze without flinching. "You will have your own rooms, your own accounts, funds I will settle on you that are yours regardless of what happens to us. You will not be required to be anyone other than who you are." A pause. "I am not your uncle." "No," she said. "I don't think you are." "Is that a yes?" She took a breath. "That is a yes," she said. "God help us both." The wedding was quiet. It was arranged with a speed that made Olympia's eyes narrow with suspicion and Bertram's with something closer to fear. He knew enough of what was coming to understand that his window for managing the situation was closing, and that the Duke of Waverley was not a man who forgot what was owed him. They were married on a morning in April at a small church on the edge of the Duke's Wiltshire estate, with the Dowager Countess of Langley as witness and Desmond Hartley, the Duke's man of affairs, as the second. Annabel wore a gown that had been delivered to Voss House 3 days before the wedding, in a box bearing no note. Pale blue wool with cream trim, exactly her size, as though someone had measured her without her knowledge, which now that she thought of it was probably precisely what had happened. She walked down the short aisle toward him, and he watched her come with those grey eyes that gave nothing away. And she thought, "I have married a mystery. I have exchanged one unfamiliar life for another." Then she reached his side, and he said, very quietly, "You look," and stopped. "What?" she asked. "Never mind," he said. But something in the way he turned to face the clergyman suggested that whatever he had been about to say was something he had been holding for a very long time. Waverley House was nothing like Voss House. This should have been obvious from the outset. A duke's country seat bears no meaningful resemblance to a solicitor's modest provincial home. But the sheer scale of it still took her breath when the carriage rolled through the gates and she saw the pale stone facade rising against the April sky, the formal gardens, the lake glinting silver in the afternoon light. "It's very large," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Do you like it?" He considered the question with apparent seriousness. "I like certain parts of it," he said. "The library, the East Terrace in the evenings, the lake in November." "Not all of it?" "The ballroom is unnecessary. I haven't used it in 11 years. She looked at him. There was something almost dry in his delivery. Not quite humour, but adjacent to it, as though humour were a language he had once spoken and half forgotten. "I'll try not to schedule a ball," she said. Something crossed his face, surprise, quickly suppressed, and then he turned back to the window. She filed it away. She was, after all, constitutionally incapable of not noticing things. He was a considerate host in the precise and slightly formal way of someone who has rehearsed consideration rather than arrived at it naturally. He showed her the house himself. He introduced her to the staff with an authority that made it immediately clear that her position was not to be questioned. Her rooms were comfortable, genuinely comfortable, not the careful minimum of someone making a point about not overindulging her. And there were books on the shelves that she suspected had been selected specifically rather than randomly placed. He was not warm, but he was not cold in the way Olympia had been cold. That particular variety of cruelty that performs consideration only to make the withdrawal of it more effective. His reserve was different. It felt less like contempt and more like distance, as though he were maintaining a specific space between them for reasons that had not yet been explained. She let it be. She had time. And she had her own work to occupy her. The first week she simply observed. She watched the household. She walked the grounds. She spoke to the staff with the easy practicality of someone who has spent 4 years on the same side of the servants' hall as they were, and noted with some amusement that this made her considerably more popular with them than the average new duchess. She read in the evenings, alone, in her sitting room, and occasionally heard his footsteps in the corridor passing her door with a regularity that she eventually identified as a pattern. He passed her door at the same time each night, paused for approximately 3 seconds, and continued on. The third week she began leaving her door slightly open. He didn't come in, but he stopped pausing, or rather, he paused longer. She was, she thought, making progress of some kind. She was simply not certain toward what. It was the 4th week when she found the letters. She had not been looking for them. She had been looking for a book. She had been told by Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, that there was an old botanical dictionary in one of the ground-floor studies, and she had gone to look for it on a grey afternoon when the rain kept her from the gardens. The study she found was not the Duke's primary room, that was upstairs, but a smaller one, clearly less used, with an older desk and walls of shelving that had the appealing disorder of a room that no one tidied because no one had been expected to enter it. She looked for the botanical dictionary. She found it on the 3rd shelf, and on the way back to the door her eye caught the edge of a wooden box on the desk. Unremarkable, dark oak, without a lock, and some instinct she could not explain made her stop. She set the book down. She opened the box. She found the letters. I have to stop here for a moment and tell you, when I first wrote this scene, I sat back from my desk and simply stared at the wall for a long time, because what Annabel was holding in her hands was not just paper. It was evidence of something that had been hiding in plain sight for years, and which changed the entire shape of the story she thought she was living. The letters were addressed to her, all of them. And they spanned, she counted with trembling hands, because she was Annabel, and counting and cataloguing was what she did when she was afraid of being overwhelmed. They spanned 7 years. The earliest was dated 1844. She would have been 15. He would have been approximately 28. Dear Annabel, I met your father today. Gerald Voss of Wiltshire, who handled a matter of contract for Desmond with more care and precision than I have seen from any solicitor in 20 years. He mentioned you 3 times in the course of a 2-hour meeting. I don't believe he noticed that he was doing it. He said your name the way a man says something that matters to him without meaning to, helplessly, as a reflex. I don't know why I'm writing this down. You'll never read it. But your father spoke of you, and I found myself wanting to know what sort of person becomes the subject of that kind of helpless, unguarded love. She sat down, slowly, in the chair behind the desk that was not her desk, in the study that was not her study, holding a letter that had not been meant for her to read. She read the next one, and the next. They were not love letters exactly, not in the beginning. They were more like a correspondence with himself, observations written to her as an imagined recipient, a habit he seemed to have developed after that first meeting with her father in 1844. He wrote about small things. A piece of legislation he found unjust, the behavior of a horse he particularly respected, a book that had surprised him. He wrote about his estate and his tenants, and the particular loneliness of having a great deal of power and very few people who spoke honestly to him. He wrote about seeing her once, from a distance, at a garden party in the summer of 1846, when she would have been 17 and he would have been 30, and she would not have known he was there. You argued with someone. I was too far away to hear what was said, but your face. You have a face that conceals almost nothing when you think no one is watching. You were angry about something that mattered to you. You didn't back down. I thought, there she is. There is the girl Gerald talked about. She read until the afternoon light failed, and she had to ring for a candle. And when the footman came in and found her at the desk with a box of letters and a face she had apparently not adequately composed, he retreated very quickly and said nothing to anyone. Or, at least, so she later discovered, said nothing to anyone except Desmond Hartley, who made a note of it, and said nothing to anyone at all. The letters stopped in 1848, the year after her father's death. No, that was not quite right. She went back through them. They stopped and then started again, in a different register, less meditative, more urgent. I have heard what Bertram Voss has done. I am making inquiries. I should have looked sooner. I'm sorry. Then, you've been there a year. You are, by all accounts I can find, well, which I take to mean that you are surviving and that you have not let them break anything essential in you. I trust that to be true because the alternative is intolerable. Then, I am nearly ready to act. There are legal complexities that Desmond is untangling. It is taking longer than I would like. I am not a patient man by nature. I am learning. Then, the most recent one, dated February of this year, less than 2 months before he had come to Voss House, I am coming. She sat with that one for a long time. She did not confront him that evening. She needed to think. And confronting Cedric Ashmore without thinking, first, was not something she was willing to attempt. She had the sense that if she walked into his study, shaking with feeling, and said, "I found your letters," without any clear sense of what she wanted from him, the conversation would not go the way it needed to go. She waited until the following morning. He was in the library when she found him. She had expected that, because she had noted his habit of taking his morning correspondence there. And he was standing at the tall windows with a letter in his hand, and the expression of someone who has just received information he already knew was coming. He heard her enter and turned, and when he saw her face, he went very still. She was holding the box. The silence lasted for several seconds. "I was looking for a botanical dictionary," she said. "I know." His voice was careful, steady, but something behind his eyes was not steady at all. "You left them in an unlocked box." "Yes." "Was that deliberate?" Another pause. "I don't know," he said, which was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her yet. She set the box on the table. She looked at him across the distance of the room. The morning light was coming through the tall windows, and it made him look not softer exactly, but more present, more human, less of the controlled facade and more of whatever was behind it. "How long?" she said. "Since 1844. "You watched me for 7 years." "I didn't watch you." Yes." A pause. "Yes, I watched you. You knew my father. Briefly. He talked about me. Endlessly," he said, and something in the word, the unexpectedness of it, the almost warmth, made her breath catch. She looked at the box, then at him. "You should have told me." "I know. When you came to Voss House, you should have said, 'I know, yes.'" He set down the letter in his hand, moved from the window, did not come toward her, stopped midway across the room as though respecting some boundary she hadn't drawn but that he had drawn for her. "I was afraid," he said, "that you would think me unstable." "I do think you're slightly unstable." "Yes." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "But perhaps slightly less so than you feared." She looked at him for a long time. She was thinking about the letters, about the specific quality of someone writing to a person they had never spoken to, not with desire at first, but with something that looked more like attention, genuine, sustained, careful attention, the kind of noticing that didn't require anything back, the kind of love, she thought, that starts as something else entirely and only becomes love through the slow accumulation of years. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Actually, not the arrangement, not the legal strategy. What do you actually want?" He met her gaze. "You," he said. "That's all. That is the complete answer." She thought about what the Dowager Countess had said. "He says what he means." "Then you might," she said slowly, "start by telling me about the 1848 letter, the one that says you should have looked sooner, the one that says you're sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father, before he died, he wrote to me. I didn't know until after. He asked me to keep an eye on his affairs, his daughter, his estate. He had a sense, I think, of what Bertram might do." His jaw tightened. "I didn't receive the letter in time. Desmond found it 3 months after Gerald died, misfiled in a stack of correspondence from that period. By then, you were already—" He stopped. "Already scrubbing floors," she said, without bitterness. "Yes." The word came out hard and flat, and she understood then that his guilt about this was not a performance. It was the real thing, old and specific and load-bearing. "I should have found it sooner. I should have known sooner. He stopped again. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have been sorry for 3 years." She stood there with the morning light between them and thought about all the ways the world had failed to protect her. Her uncle's greed, the law's indifference, the simple, terrible bad luck of a misfiled letter. Then she walked toward him. He went very still as she crossed the room. She stopped within arm's reach of him and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the 7 years of distance between them was right there in the space, almost visible. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold. She held them anyway. He made a sound, quiet, barely audible, that she thought was probably the sound of someone who had been holding something for a very long time, finally being allowed to set it down. "You have a great deal to make up for," she said. "I know. I intend to let you." 3 days after the morning of the letters, Bertram Voss came to Waverley House. He arrived without notice, which was itself a statement. A man who had been a person of some standing once, and who had not yet fully internalized the fact that he no longer was. He came in a hired carriage, which the gatekeeper admitted because the gatekeeper had not yet received instructions to the contrary, and he arrived at the front door and had the particular audacity to ring the bell as though he were expected. Annabel was in the east garden when Mrs. Fenn found her, and the expression on the housekeeper's face told her everything she needed to know before a word was spoken. "Mr. Voss is in the entrance hall," Mrs. Fenn said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has strong opinions she is professionally restraining. "He is asking for you." Annabel went cold, then very still. Then she said, "Where is His Grace?" "In his study. Please tell him Mr. Voss has arrived." A pause. "And please do not leave Mr. Voss alone in any room with anything valuable." She walked in through the side entrance, which brought her past the foot of the main staircase, and she saw Bertram before he saw her. He was standing in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, and his jaw set in that particular way she recognized from 4 years of living in fear of it. The expression of a man who believes aggression is always an available tool, who has never had sufficient reason to revise that belief. He looked older, diminished. The good coat he was wearing had seen better days. He saw her, and his expression shifted through several things quickly before settling on something that was performing warmth. "Annabel," he said. "My dear girl." She said nothing. She stood at the foot of the stairs and looked at him and said absolutely nothing, and after a moment his smile thinned. "I've come to discuss a private family matter," he said. "I think we might speak alone." "No," she said. The word fell between them with a finality she had spent 4 years not being allowed. She watched him process it. Watched the old authority try to reassert itself and find no purchase. "Now listen!" "You will not speak to my wife alone." The voice came from the upper landing. Quiet, unhurried. The kind of voice that does not need to be raised because it has never had to compete for attention. Cedric descended the staircase without haste. He was not in his riding clothes. He had been working at his desk, she knew, which meant he was in his day coat, and there was nothing in his manner that was overtly threatening. He was simply present in the way that a very large weight on a very small surface is present, without drama, and yet entirely impossible to ignore. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped beside Annabel. He did not touch her. He did not need to. He looked at Bertram Voss with those grey eyes and said, "You were not invited here." Bertram's jaw worked. "There are matters, outstanding matters, concerning my niece's—" "She is not your niece." The correction was precise and final. "She is my wife. She has been my wife for 6 weeks. Whatever authority you believed you had over her person and her affairs ended when she left your house. If you were unclear on that point, I am clarifying it now. The legal proceedings are not a negotiation." Cedric's voice had not changed in pitch or pace. It was that unchangingness that made it frightening. There was no escalation because there was no need for escalation. He was already at the end. "Your crimes against Gerald Voss's estate are documented. The fraud charges are prepared. The outcome of those proceedings is not in question. If you have come here hoping to discuss alternatives, you have wasted your journey." Bertram's face had gone an ugly, mottled colour. He looked at Annabel with the expression she recognized, the one that said she was the problem. She had always been the problem. She had been the source of every inconvenience in his life from the moment her father died and left her for him to deal with. "You think you've won something," he said to her, low, mean, the voice he used when no one else could hear. "You think he'll keep you. You were nothing when I found you, and you're—" "That's enough." Cedric had not moved and had not raised his voice, and yet the words stopped Bertram mid-sentence with the efficiency of a door closing on a cold wind. The grey eyes had not changed expression. They did not need to. There was something in them that Annabel had not seen before, or rather had seen only in outline, which was the complete absence of any restraint at all. Every other emotion Cedric Ashmore carried he managed carefully. This one he did not manage because he did not need to. "You will leave this house," he said, "and you will not return. You will not write to my wife. You will not send messages through intermediaries. You will not seek to communicate with her in any form. If you do, I will treat it as a violation of her peace and respond accordingly." A pause. Not for effect, she thought, but because he was choosing the last words with care. "I am familiar with every debt you hold, every creditor you have avoided, every legal vulnerability you have accumulated over the past decade. I have not used all of it. I have been restrained because restraint seemed adequate. If you require me to stop being restrained, I will stop." The hall was entirely silent. Bertram Voss looked at the Duke of Waverley for a long moment. Then something went out of his face. Not quickly, not all at once, but in the way that a fire goes out when the last of the fuel is exhausted. The aggression, the bluster, the years of accumulated certainty that he was the one who held authority over the people around him, all of it extinguished. He put his hat on. He walked to the door. He did not look at Annabel again. The door closed. The hall was very quiet. Annabel stood at the bottom of the stairs and breathed for a moment. Then she looked at Cedric, who was still standing beside her, watching the Dalka with an expression that was resolving slowly back into its customary composure, the way a disturbed surface of water settles. "You were very calm," she said. "Yes." "You were also frightening." "Yes." A pause. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly. The old fear had risen when she first saw Bertram in the hall. The specific, conditioned fear of someone who has spent years at the mercy of another person's moods. But it had not risen. It had met something else in her, something steadier, something that had been building over 6 weeks of slow, careful accumulation, and it had subsided. "I think so," she said. "Yes, I think I am." She looked at him. "Thank you." Something in his expression shifted, not quite the shadow of a smile this time, but something warmer. "You didn't need me to handle that," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I was glad you were there." He looked at her for a moment. His hand came up and settled at the small of her back. Brief, gentle, the first deliberate touch he had offered since their wedding day, and then dropped again. She thought, there it is. The proof, if she had still needed it, that the distance he maintained was not indifference. It was care. The specific, over-controlled, deeply inconvenient care of a man who is terrified of asking for more than is being offered. She filed that away too. The reckoning with Bertram Voss came on a grey morning in May. Desmond Hartley had spent 3 years documenting the fraud, the suppressed will, the misappropriated income, the borrowings against properties he did not own, the legal misrepresentations made to obtain guardianship. It was, Desmond told Annabel, with the satisfaction of a craftsman presenting finished work, thorough. Cedric had decided, after the visit to Waverley House, that the pace of the proceedings should accelerate. The legal complexities that had been untangling for 3 years were untangled. The date was set. Annabel was not present for the first part, but she was present for the last. It was Cedric who had suggested it. He had looked at her across the breakfast table one morning and said simply, "You should be there. It was done to you. You should see it ended." She had understood then, more clearly than she had understood anything else about him, what he considered the point of all of this. Not just the legal outcome, not the financial restoration, significant as it was. The thing he had been working toward with that slow and patient precision for 3 years, the thing that mattered to him, was that she should see it, that she should be in the room. The meeting took place in a solicitor's office in the county town, and Bertram Voss arrived with the haggard look of a man who has not slept well in several months. The solicitors were present, and the documentation was present, and Cedric sat at the head of the table with the stillness of someone who has already won and is simply overseeing the formal acknowledgement of that fact. Annabel sat beside him. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and she watched. The charges were laid out with a methodical precision that she found, under the circumstances, deeply satisfying. The suppressed will, the fraudulent guardianship application, the misappropriation of estate funds over 4 years, the borrowings against properties he had no right to leverage. Each item placed on the table like a stone, one after another, until the weight of them was visible on Bertram's face. He tried to argue. His solicitor tried to argue. Cedric let them finish and then said, without inflection, "The documentation is comprehensive. We have the original will with its notarial certification. We have the financial records from your accounts. We have the correspondence." A pause. "We also have testimony from your former household staff regarding the conditions in which Miss Voss, my wife, was kept in what was legally her own home." He let that sit for a moment. "I would encourage you not to pursue a contested position." Bertram looked across the table at Annabel. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not look frightened, because she was not frightened. Not here, not anymore. She was simply present in the way she had always been present, noticing everything, feeling everything, not showing more than she chose to show. He looked away first. The agreement was signed before noon. The financial consequences were immediate and substantial. The house, her father's house, was to be restored to its rightful heir. The fraud charges, once the settlement was executed, would be managed through civil proceedings rather than criminal, which was a mercy Cedric had agreed to at Annabel's quiet request. Not out of kindness toward Bertram, she had told him, out of indifference. She did not want to spend the next year attending criminal proceedings. She wanted to be finished with it. They walked out of the solicitor's office into the grey May morning, and she stood on the street for a moment and looked up at the sky. "It's done," Desmond said from somewhere behind them. "Yes," Cedric said. Annabel exhaled, slowly, the full length of 4 years released in a single breath. She felt Cedric's hand settle at her elbow, steadying, present, the same gesture he had offered in the entrance hall of Waverley House. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. The social consequences of Bertram's ruin unfolded over the following weeks, as such things do in county society. The Voss family's financial collapse was not announced. It simply became known. Through the careful withdrawal of invitations, the altered expressions of the formerly cordial, the silence where once there had been conversation. Georgiana and Mabel lost their places on the season's guest lists. Olympia was not received at 2 houses she had previously considered allies. Bertram sold his remaining assets and retreated to a modest situation in a northern town whose name nobody in Wiltshire seemed able to quite recall when asked. Annabel heard all of this from a safe distance in the library at Waverley House. She felt, when Desmond finished his account, not the triumph she had expected, but something quieter. A settling. The sound of a door closing on a room she had never wanted to be in. "The house will need attention," Desmond said carefully, "before it can be leased or sold." "I want to see it first," she said. Cedric drove her himself. It was a bright July morning, and the countryside was green and entirely indifferent to the drama of human lives, which she found she didn't mind. She had grown, over the course of 3 months, into a kind of ease with him that surprised her. It had not been quick. He was not easy to know, in the way that some people are not easy to know, their depth requiring time and specific conditions to reveal itself. But she had observed him long, enough now to understand the architecture of him, the precision that was not coldness but care, the reserve that was not disinterest but a habitual protection against disappointment, the flashes of something she could only call tenderness, quickly controlled, that appeared most often when he thought she wasn't watching. She was always watching. He knew that by now. She stood in front of her father's house in the morning light and looked at it for a long time. It was smaller than she remembered, shabbier. Bertram had not spent much on its upkeep. The garden was overgrown. One of the ground floor windows was cracked. She thought of her father sitting in his chair by the fire, reading aloud to her. She thought of her mother, who had died when Annabel was 9, and whose absence had always been a quiet ache rather than a sharp one. She thought of the morning she had stood in this doorway with a single bag of her own belongings, and watched 2 of Bertram's men carry her father's books into the hall to be assessed for sale. She had not cried then. She had been too stunned. She did not cry now either. She simply stood there and let herself feel the full weight of it, what had been taken, what had been done, what it had cost her. And then she let it settle. Cedric stood beside her. He had not spoken since they arrived. He understood she had learned the value of silence, when to fill it, and when to simply be present in it. After a long time, she said, My father called me his clever girl." "I know," he said. "He mentioned that." She looked at him. He was looking at the house, his jaw set, and she understood the particular quality of his silence. He was angry, on her behalf, at everything that had happened in this house after her father died. He had been angry about it for 3 years. He had just been very quiet about it. She took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands, and then at her, and she said, "I want to sell it. I don't want to keep it. I just wanted to see it first." "All right. And I want to go home." He held her gaze for a moment. "Waverley?" "Yes," she said. "Waverley." Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who did not know how to read him would have noticed. But she was Annabel, and she noticed everything. And what she saw was a man who had been holding his breath for some time finally release it. "Then let's go home," he said. It was August when it almost happened the first time. She had taken to walking the East Terrace in the evenings, partly because the view across the lake was genuinely beautiful, and partly because she had discovered, approximately 3 weeks into the habit, that he walked there too. Not with her, not exactly. He would appear at the far end of the terrace with a glass of something and stand looking at the water, and she would be at the near end doing the same, and they would exist in the same space in the particular way they had developed, which was close enough to be companionable and far enough to maintain the fiction of separateness they were both, she suspected, growing less interested in maintaining. On the evening in question, the sun was going down behind the tree line in long bars of amber, and the lake had gone the colour of old bronze, and she had been watching it long enough that she didn't hear him come to stand beside her until he was already there. Not at the far end, beside her, close enough that the sleeve of his coat was an inch from her arm. She didn't move. Neither did he. They stood there for a long time, watching the light go out of the sky, and she was intensely aware of the warmth of him and the specific quality of the silence between them, which had changed. She could not have said exactly when, but it had changed from the careful silence of two people managing their distance to something charged and breathless and mutual. "Annabel," he said. Her name. Just that, in the voice he used when there was no one else present, lower than his public register, with something in it she had been cataloguing for months without allowing herself to name. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, and they were close, closer than they had been since the wedding, close enough that she could see the specific grey of his eyes in the fading light, and the thing that was in them was entirely unmanaged for once. All of it visible, the years of it, the wanting and the restraint and the barely contained, something that she now understood had been sitting just beneath the surface of every conversation they had ever had. His hand came up, slowly, and settled against her face, his thumb at her cheekbone, his fingers at her jaw, the touch so careful it felt like a question. She did not answer it. She stood very still, her heart doing something irregular, her breath gone shallow, and she thought, yes, obviously yes. I have been moving toward this since March. And then from somewhere inside the house, a door, and Mrs. Fenn's voice carrying across the terrace, calling that dinner was served. He stepped back. The hand dropped. He looked at the lake. She looked at the lake too. "We should go in," he said. His voice was entirely steady, which she found both impressive and deeply frustrating. "Yes," she said, with equal steadiness, which cost her considerably. They went in. They sat across from each other at dinner and talked about the tenants and the harvest estimates and a letter he had received from his man in London, and neither of them mentioned the terrace, and she spent the entire meal in a state of acute awareness of every move he made, and every time his eyes came to her face and then moved deliberately away. That night she sat in her room for a long time with a book she did not read. She thought, he is waiting for me to be certain. He has been waiting in one form or another for years. He will wait as long as I need, she thought. I am certain. I have been certain for longer than I have admitted. She thought, October. I will tell him in October, when the light changes and there is a fire in the library, and it feels like the right kind of moment. She was, she reflected, perhaps slightly more romantic than she had previously given herself credit for. They attended a dinner in February at the county seat of a neighbouring earl. It was the first significant social occasion Annabel had attended since her marriage, and she prepared for it with more care than she would have admitted. She was being seen for the first time as the Duchess of Waverley, and she was aware that there would be people present who had known her as Bertram Voss's unpaid household drudge. She stood in the entrance hall of Waverley House in a gown of deep green silk, his choice, or rather the choice of whoever he had instructed, with pearls at her throat, and her hair dressed by a woman who actually knew what she was doing, and she looked in the mirror and thought, well. He came down the stairs and stopped at the bottom, looking at her, with the expression she had learned to read as his version of significant emotional response. The complete stillness that meant he was controlling something considerable. You look like a duchess, he said. I am a duchess. Yes, the corner of his mouth. You are. The dinner was not difficult. The county understood power, and Cedric's power was not subtle. The guests who had known Annabel in her previous circumstances looked at her, and then looked at him and made their calculations quickly. There were no unkind remarks. There were, in fact, a great number of people who were suddenly and transparently delighted to renew or establish their acquaintance with her. It was toward the end of the evening that it happened. She had been speaking with two ladies near the fireplace when a gentleman she did not know, young, fair-haired, with the easy confidence of someone who has never had occasion to question his own welcome, inserted himself into the conversation with a smile directed specifically at her. Lady Waverley, he said, with a warmth considerably beyond what their acquaintance of 3 minutes warranted. I don't believe we've met. I'm told you're newly arrived in the county. Relatively, she said pleasantly. Then you must allow me to be among the first to welcome you properly. He was looking at her with the particular attention of someone who has decided to be charming and expects it to work. I find myself hoping we'll have many opportunities to become better acquainted. She was aware, in the peripheral way she was always aware of his location, that Cedric had been across the room a moment ago and was no longer there. He was, instead, beside her. She had not heard him cross the room. She did not know how he moved so quietly for such a large man, but he was there, standing at her shoulder with a glass of wine, and an expression of absolute social pleasantness, and eyes that were doing something entirely different from his expression. Hartley, he said, addressing the young man with perfect courtesy, I don't believe you've been introduced to my wife. The word landed with a specificity that was not accidental. My wife, not the Duchess, not Lady Waverley. The possessive was deliberate, precise, and unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The young man, whose name was apparently Hartley, received the word with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. Your Grace, he said, I was just saying to Lady Waverley. I'm sure you were. Cedric's voice was entirely pleasant. His eyes were not. If you'll excuse us. It was not a question. Hartley excused them. Cedric guided her, one hand at her back, the same gesture she had been cataloguing since the entrance hall, toward the far end of the room, where a pair of chairs near the window provided a temporary remove from the crowd. That was unnecessary, she said, when they were out of earshot. Was it? He was harmless. Possibly. He sat beside her and looked out at the room with the expression of someone conducting a survey. I found him irritating. You find most people irritating. Most people are irritating. A pause. He was looking at you. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was still watching the room, his jaw set at an angle she had come to associate with feelings he was not prepared to articulate directly. "Cedric," she said. "What? Are you jealous?" A considerable pause. "I prefer particular," he said finally. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, very quietly, so that only he could hear, "You have no reason to be. Either of those things." He turned then, looked at her with those grey eyes that had been watching her, in one form or another, for 7 years. Something in them was unguarded in a way she had only glimpsed before. Raw, almost, the specific vulnerability of someone who has wanted something for so long that the wanting itself has become a kind of wound. "I know," he said. "Good." She held his gaze. "Then stop looking at Mr. Hartley like you're calculating something unpleasant and talk to me." The shadow at the corner of his mouth again. "What would you like to talk about?" "Anything," she said. "I simply like talking to you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned slightly, in his chair, away from the room, toward her, and said, "Tell me what you made of the Countess's remarks at dinner. I thought you disagreed with her, but were too polite to say so." She had disagreed. She told him so, at length, and he listened with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was the most genuine thing about him. They talked until the carriages were called, and when they rode home through the cold February night, she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt him, after a careful moment, rest his cheek against her hair. They did not speak about it. They did not need to. It was October before he kissed her. She would have said afterward that she had not been impatient. She had simply been watching, in the way she always watched, and waiting for the moment when he would stop managing the distance between them and simply close it. She was at the piano in the blue sitting room, playing something her father had taught her. A simple melody, nothing fashionable, the kind of thing one plays when no one is listening. Except he was listening. He had been standing in the doorway for 4 minutes. She knew because she had counted. She finished the piece, said without turning, "Are you going to come in?" He came in. He sat in the chair near the window, which was his customary position in any room they shared, near enough to be present, far enough to maintain the illusion of keeping his distance. She turned on the piano bench to face him. "You've been thinking about something for 3 days," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "Are you going to tell me what?" A long pause. Then, "I have loved you," he said, "since the moment I first understood what kind of person you were. That was a long time ago." He met her gaze steadily. "I have not said so because I was not certain you wanted me to. I am still not certain, but I am. I find I can't continue not saying it." She sat with that for a moment. He let her, which was one of the many things she had come to appreciate about him. "I found your letters," she said finally, "in March. I read all of them." "I know. You knew what I was reading about you." "Yes? And you waited." "I wanted you to decide," he said, without feeling obligated. She stood up from the piano bench. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, and he looked up at her from the chair, and for once the careful management of his expression was completely absent. There was nothing on his face but what he felt, undisguised, the kind of looking that she recognized from his letters, the sustained and careful attention that had started as something else and become this. "I stopped fighting you," she said quietly, "about 2 months ago." He stood, slowly, until they were level and close, and she could see the grey eyes up close, and they were not cold at all. They were the opposite of cold, something deep and still and entirely focused on her. "I should have stopped this years ago," he said. "What happened to you?" "I should have—" "Cedric," she said. He stopped. "Stop apologizing," she said, "and kiss me." He did. It was nothing like she had expected, and entirely what she had wanted. Careful at first, then less careful, his hands finding her face the way someone handles something they have been afraid for too long to touch. She felt the years of it in the way he held her, the 7 years of letters, the 3 years of distance, the months of deliberate, respectful, infuriating restraint. All of it, held in the specific warmth of his hands against her face and his mouth on hers and the October light coming through the windows. When he finally lifted his head, she had her hands fisted in his lapels and his forehead was resting against hers, and they were both breathing slightly, unevenly. 7 years, she said. Yes. You were very patient. I was terrified, he said, which was, she thought, the most honest thing he had ever said to her, which meant it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She laughed. She hadn't meant to, but she did, and he looked startled, and then the corner of his mouth curved slowly into something that was unmistakably a smile. The first real one she had seen, and it entirely transformed his face, and she thought, there he is. There is the man in the letters. She pulled him back down. The winter at Waverley was different from every winter Annabel could remember. Her father's house was sold in November. The funds went into accounts in her name, her own, independent accounts, as he had promised, which she checked regularly, not because she mistrusted him, but because the act of looking at figures that were hers, genuinely hers, with her name on them and no one else's authority over them, was something she had not been able to do in 4 years, and she was not quite finished being astonished by it. She wrote to the Dowager Countess, who replied with characteristic brevity, "I told you he was honest. Stop being surprised and enjoy it." She was working on that. The household suited her. She had taken on the management of the tenants' welfare and the estate's charitable activities with a quiet efficiency that seemed to genuinely surprise her husband, though she could not imagine why, given that he had known for years she was competent. She told him so. He said that knowing something abstractly and witnessing it in practice were different, and that he had significantly underestimated the practical consequence of having someone who noticed everything. She took this as the compliment she was relatively sure it was intended to be. They were not, she thought, a conventional couple. They were both too private, too self-contained, too accustomed to managing their interior lives alone. There were silences between them that another couple might have found uncomfortable, and that they found simply companionable. She was learning the contours of him, the ways he showed care that weren't the obvious ways, the small, precise acts of attention that accumulated over weeks into something that felt very much like being known. He had her piano moved to the library, without comment, without mentioning it. She came down one morning, and it was there, positioned by the window she preferred, and when she looked at him over her morning tea, he was reading his correspondence with complete composure. "The acoustics are better in here," he said, without looking up. "Is that what prompted it?" "Yes," he said, which was transparently untrue and made her smile. She played for him in the evenings. He read or wrote letters, or simply sat with his eyes closed in the particular way of someone who is not sleeping but listening. She played for longer than she had intended, most evenings. She did not think this was coincidental. There is a particular morning in March that she would remember for the rest of her life. She woke early. She had kept the habit of early rising from her years at Voss House, and she suspected it would never fully leave her, and dressed and went down to the library before he was awake. The fire was laid, but not yet lit. The piano was where it had been all winter by the window, and the early light was grey and soft, and the fields beyond the glass were white with frost. She sat at the piano and played the melody her father had taught her. She heard him come in while she was playing, heard the fire being lit. He did it himself, she knew, when there was no one else about, heard the quiet movement of him settling in his chair. She finished the melody. She played it again. Then his voice, from across the room. "He would have been very proud of you." She didn't turn. Her hands were on the keys, unmoving. "I know," she said. "I want you to know that I know too," he said. "Not just what he said to me. What I've seen for myself, the way you've carried yourself through everything that happened. What you are." A pause. "I know what I have." She sat with that for a moment. The morning light was strengthening through the frost-edged windows, and the fire was beginning to warm the room, and she was in her own house, in her own library, with her own hands on her own piano keys, and her father's melody in the air. She turned on the bench. He was in his chair. He was looking at her, the grey eyes full of that sustained and careful attention that she now understood had been there for years before she had known what it was or who it was for. "Come here," she said. He came. She had been invisible once. She knew what it felt like to occupy a room without being seen, to move through a life that had been decided for you, that ground you down daily with a patience almost indistinguishable from cruelty, and to keep your sense of yourself alive in the only place no one could reach it, the interior, the private, the self that existed behind the composed face and the folded hands and the years of learned smallness. She knew, too, what it felt like when someone looked at you and simply refused to look away. Not across a ballroom, though there had been that. Not in a drawing room negotiation, though there had been that too. But in an entrance hall, on a grey morning in May, when a man she had been afraid of for 4 years tried one final time to remind her of what she had been. And the Duke of Waverley said, in a voice that required no elevation, "She is not your niece. She is my wife." And in those 6 words made it clear that he had seen her, had always seen her, and that whatever the world had tried to make of her, he had never once agreed. Her father had called her his clever girl. Her husband had called her mine. Not as a claim, but as a fact he had been carrying for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to set it down in front of her and let her decide what to do with it. She had decided. She had never regretted it. 50 years. Not enough. And so, my friends, that is the story of Annabel Voss, the girl with the red hands, and the Duke of Waverley, who watched for 7 years and waited 3 more, and wrote hundreds of letters he never sent, and who, in the end, stood in his own entrance hall and told the man who had broken her that she was his wife, and let those 2 words carry 7 years of everything he had never been able to say out loud. So tell me, what would you have done in her place? When you found those letters, when you understood the full weight of what they meant, would you have run from it or toward it? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more coming, and I don't want you to miss them. And wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is, whatever you were carrying when you pressed play, I hope this was worth an hour of it. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.